Hey guys, welcome back to another Planet Mithril Paints, and today we'll be continuing our fellowship series with the Elven Prince himself, Legolas Greenleaf. Keen senses, unparalleled with a bow, and a key player in the events of the War of the Ring. We hope you enjoy this tutorial, and without further delay, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. As with Arwen, it's important we slightly change the hue of Legolas' skin tone to reflect his elvish features and fairer complexion. However, as normal, we'll start by base coating all the exposed skin with Bugman's Glow. So we want to lighten Legolas' complexion earlier than we normally would. To do this, we're going to increase the concentration of lighter pigmented skin tones in the first layer stages. Layer over all the skin with a 75-25% mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Bugman's Glow. Once the wash is dry, relayer over with the previous mix, being careful to leave the right clean flesh shade showing in the deepest possible recesses. Remember, Legolas has impeccable skin, so be sure to make sure you keep your paints thinned down slightly to create a smooth, clean finish overall. For the next layer stage, we'll be adding in Pallid Witch Flesh with Acadian Flesh Tone in order to further reinforce the fair elven skin tone we want to achieve. Apply a layer here with a mix of Acadian Flesh Tone and Pallid Witch Flesh. Start breaking up the face into the most defined areas. These include the nose, forehead, perfect angular cheekbones, chin, and separating out the fingers gripping the bow and arrows. Add more Pallid Witch Flesh to the mix at the first highlight stage. Now focus on some of the most prominent features and creating definition across Legolas' face. Legolas has a very defined, angular, yet delicate features, so it's important your highlights are tight and precise to try and portray this in your finished model. Finally, add more Pallid Witch Flesh to the mix and apply an extreme edge highlight on the nose, upper cheekbones and brow, as well as a dot highlight across the knuckles to create definition over the hands. Once you're happy, you can carefully pick out the eyes using Abaddon Black and Pallid Witch Flesh. Now we want to start off Legolas's golden flowing locks with a base coat of Steel Legion drab. Make sure to pick out all the hair flowing around the shoulders and down the front of the body too. Apply an all-over layer with a mix of Steel Legion drab and Zemesi Desert. Once the wash is dry, reapply the previous mix with some pallid witch flesh added in. Now you want to focus on blocking out the large areas of hair and separating out areas such as the braid, hairs down the front of the tunic and the top of the head, leaving the Agrax earth shade showing in the deepest possible recesses. Add more pallid witch flesh to the mix and start carefully defining the individual hairs across Legolas's scalp. You also need to carefully separate the braiding going down the back and further defining the rest of the cascading hair around his shoulders. This is all pretty well defined on the sculpt. The only areas of potential trouble will be across the scalp itself. Just focus on keeping your lines as straight as possible to create a natural look to the hair. Finally, add even more pallid witch flesh to the mix, bringing your mix to an approximate 75-25% split between the pallid witch flesh and the original mix. Apply this to the tips and outermost curls of the hair to create natural flow, and use your previous highlights as a guide for where to apply this across the rest of the scalp. Legolas's tunic is quite unique as it's comprised of two separate colour tones. The inner areas and the backs of the shoulder pads are a darker green compared to the skirts, and the outer areas of tunic which are a lighter green. It's important we define this enough to stay true to the character as well as keep it complementary enough that it creates a uniform look overall. We're going to start by base coating the skirts and outer areas of the tunic with a 50-50 mix of Castellan green and dryad bark. Legolas's tunic is comprised of a lot of autumnal colours which reflect the style of his kin, Mirkwood. To achieve the look we want for the tunic, we'll be using a similar painting method for both sections, but with subtle variations using a variety of greens and browns that maintain the autumnal, naturalistic feel. Apply an all-over layer to the outer tunic by adding some Zemesi Desert to the previous mix. Once the wash is dry, re-layer over with the previous mixture, leaving the Athonian camo shade showing in the deepest recesses. As the tunic is quite flat and almost undefined, it may be challenging to work out where your layers need to go. Focus on the subtle folds and creases of material and let these be your guidelines for the following layer and highlighting stages. Add more Zemesi Desert for the next layer stage. Start focusing on the outer areas of material with clean straight lines to help define the straight angular look of his tunic. We're using Zemesi Desert to highlight here as it naturally lifts the tone of the autumnal colours we're aiming for, but also adds a slight degree of richness which will complement the tunic's overall feel. Continue adding Zemesi Desert in gradual increments to the mix for however many layer stages you want to do after this. We didn't show them all here for the sake of the time in the video, but by the time you're done your mix should be no more than approximately 60% Zemesi Desert and 40% the original mix. Now for the final edge highlight, add some Ogryn camo to the mix. This will just help to lift the tone nicely for the final highlight. Now you want to focus on the absolute edges of the tunic material. As the tunic isn't that well defined and has a lot of straight lines to it, it's fairly easy to spot where this highlight needs to go. Now we're going to focus on the inner tunic and the material down the back of his shoulders. We're going to be applying the same base coat, but instead of Castellan green, we'll be using Deathcorp drab to give us the overall darker tone that we want for this particular section of the tunic. Once the wash is dry, layer over again by adding Zemesi Desert to the Deathcorp drab dry bark mix. Here it is crucially important to leave the vertical grooves down the front of the tunic showing the wash and to try and avoid bleeding over onto the outer areas of the already finished tunic. Add more Zanesi Desert to the mix of the first highlight. Now start defining the slight ripples in the inner tunic, as well as defining the collar and the folds of material around the backs of his arms. Now for the final few highlight layers, start adding small amounts of Nurgling Green to the overall mixture. Again, as with the Ogren camo on the outer tunic, this just helps to lift the overall tone of the material to create some natural definition and make those autumnal colours really pop just that little bit more. Be careful not to overdo the addition of Nurgling Green here, as too much too quickly will create too stark a contrast and end up looking quite Tron-like and unnatural. Legolas has a lot of brown detailing to him, and we want to try and create some slight differentiation between some of these areas to keep the model looking visually appealing. Base coat the bow, boots, belts, straps, braces and arrow shafts with dried bark. The boots and braces have got a lot of definition to them and wouldn't benefit from an immediate Gawthor Brown edge highlight here. Apply a layer over these areas with a mix of Dryad Bark and Gawthor Brown, leaving the Dryad Bark base showing in the recesses to create a nice mid-tone which will complement the final edge highlight more naturally. Finally, apply an edge highlight with pure Gawthor brown to the outer edges of all the brown areas, defining the edges of the belts, straps and boots, and separating out the arrows in the quiver. With the bow, carefully draw your paint in random vertical lines down the length to get a wood grain effect. If you happen to make these too thick by accident, you can touch up again with drier bark until you're happy with the overall effect. The quiver we want to make a slightly different shade of brown, just to break up the concentration of drier bark. Base coat the quiver with a mix of Mornfang brown and Rhinox hide. Don't worry about avoiding the gold detail at this point, because we'll tackle this just a little bit later on. Add some Gawthor brown to the mix to highlight the sides of the quiver. Carefully pick out the inner robes beneath the tunic and the arm sleeves with Dark Reaper. Be extremely careful here to avoid bleeding out onto the finished tunic. We want a pale, almost washed out colour to Legolas's blue robes, which will serve as a subtle contrast to the sheer amount of greens and browns we've currently been using. Apply a layer with pure Thunderhawk blue. Apply a layer with a mix of Thunderhawk blue and Fenrisian grey. Finally, apply an extreme highlight of pure Fenrisian grey to the outer and upper folds of the inner robes and the arm sleeves. Carefully now, with a steady hand, pick up all the gold detailing across the quiver, as well as the belt buckle across the front of Legolas's tunic with Runelord brass. Again, we're using a very muted gold for these metals, as a vibrant bright gold wouldn't fit with the autumnal natural colour palette we've been trying to stick to. Once the wash is dry, carefully apply a dot highlight onto the gold detailing with Sycorax bronze. Time for more green! Apply a base coat to Legolas's trousers with a mix of Caliban green and dried bark. Again, this is complementary enough to the other greens on the model, but subtly different enough to stand out as material drenched in shadow. Once the wash is dry, add Talon sand to the mix for the next layer stage, leaving the wash showing in the creases behind the knees and the upper areas of the thighs. Finally, add more Talon sand to the mix and apply an edge highlight to the upper creases of material. Carefully now pick out the arrow fletchings and the shafts of the daggers with Rakoth flesh. Once the wash is dry, apply a dot highlight of pallid witch flesh to the fletchings and an extreme edge highlight to the dagger shaft. And there we have it, Legolas Greenleaf ready to join the Fellowship and start his adventure as one of the heroes in Middle-earth, stood poised, vigilant and ready against the forces of Sauron.